Picture this. You step outside your house tomorrow morning, and instead of seeing the maple tree in your yard, you're staring up at a towering mushroom that's literally 3 times taller than your roof. And I'm not talking about some fantasy movie nonsense. This actually happened on Earth for an absolutely mind-blowing stretch of time. Welcome to the most bizarre chapter in our planet's history, when fungus ruled everything. And when I say ruled everything, I mean these things were the undisputed kings of the landscape for longer than mammals have even existed. We're diving into a world so alien, so completely different from anything you've ever seen, that it makes science fiction look boring. But here's what's really going to mess with your head. If these giant mushroom skyscrapers hadn't lost their grip on power, you wouldn't be watching this video right now. You wouldn't exist. None of us would. The entire course of evolution, every animal you've ever seen, every forest you've ever walked through, all of it happened because these fungal giants made one critical mistake that cost them their empire. So buckle up, because we're about to explore the most important evolutionary failure in Earth's history. And trust me, by the end of this series, you're going to look at every mushroom in your grocery store completely differently. Let's rewind the clock about 400 million years. Forget everything you think you know about what Earth looks like. Forget green forests. Forget rolling meadows. Forget literally any landscape that would look remotely familiar to you. The Earth back then was basically a different planet entirely. You want to talk about a boring commute? Try walking around during the Devonian period. The most exciting thing you'd encounter would be stepping on a millipede. And that's if you were having a really adventurous day. There were no trees. 0. Not a single one anywhere on the entire planet. No grass, no flowers, no bushes, nothing that would reach higher than your ankles on their absolute best day. The tallest plants you'd find would make the weeds poking through sidewalk cracks look impressive by comparison. Most of the landscape was just endless stretches of bare rock and dirt, and not even good dirt. We're talking about soil that was basically still in development mode. Plants hadn't figured out how to properly decompose and create rich, fertile ground yet. The atmosphere was absolutely insane, too. 10 times more carbon dioxide than we have today. 10 times. The entire planet was like walking into a greenhouse that someone had sealed shut and forgotten about. You'd step outside and feel like you were trying to breathe through a wet towel. The humidity was so intense that everything was constantly misty and damp. And the heat, tropical temperatures everywhere, all year round. The kind of sticky, oppressive heat that makes you want to crawl into an air-conditioned cave and never come out. Except there was no relief anywhere, because this was just how the whole planet worked back then. The wildlife situation was equally depressing. The most advanced creatures were basically things that looked like they belonged under a rotting log in someone's backyard. Millipedes crawling around, some early insects that hadn't figured out how to fly yet, and maybe some scorpions if you were unlucky enough to run into them. These were the apex predators of their time, which tells you everything you need to know about how low the evolutionary bar was set. No mammals existed yet. no birds, no reptiles, no amphibians. Even fish were still these weird, primitive, jawless things that looked like someone had tried to design a fish while blindfolded and slightly drunk. The most exciting animal encounter you might have would be accidentally stepping on something crunchy and hoping it wasn't venomous. Rivers and lakes existed, sure, but they were warm and gross, like bath water that had been sitting out for way too long. The silence was probably the most unsettling part, though. Without birds chirping or large animals making noise, the loudest sounds would have been wind blowing across empty rocks, and maybe some water trickling somewhere in the distance. It was quiet in that deeply uncomfortable way that makes you realize how much background noise living things usually create. The whole planet felt empty, like walking through a massive abandoned parking lot. Except it wasn't abandoned because nothing had ever been there in the first place. But here's where things get absolutely wild. In this seemingly dead, hostile, and frankly depressing landscape, something was growing that would completely redefine what it meant to be tall on Earth. And these things were about to get so ridiculously massive that they'd make modern redwood trees look like house plants. Meet the absolute champions of prehistoric Earth. Scientists call them Prototaxites, which honestly sounds like the name of some aggressive computer virus, but whatever. These were the giants I mentioned at the beginning, and when I say giants, I'm talking about mushrooms that grew 30 feet tall. That's taller than most two-story houses. That's wider than your dining room table, just sitting there in the middle of nowhere, being a mushroom for 50 million years straight. Let that sink in for a second. 50 million years. That's almost as long as mammals have been the dominant life form on Earth. These fungal towers were just chilling, doing their mushroom thing, while everything else was still trying to figure out how to exist without being microscopic. And here's the really fun part about scientific discovery. When researchers first found fossils of these things, they had absolutely no clue what they were looking at. For over a century, scientists were completely stumped. Some thought they were ancient trees, which was confusing because they were finding them in rock layers from way before trees had evolved. Others suggested maybe they were some kind of giant seaweed that had somehow gotten really, really lost. A few researchers even proposed they might be enormous lichens, which are basically just fungi with commitment issues anyway. But the fossils looked like massive stone tree trunks, which created this whole mystery that had scientists arguing for decades. It was like finding a smartphone buried in ancient Roman ruins. Something clearly wasn't adding up. You had Team Tree fighting with Team Seaweed, fighting with Team We have no idea what this thing is. Meanwhile, these fossil specimens were just sitting in museums around the world, being tall and mysterious, and probably judging everyone for their terrible guesses. Then, in the early 2000s, someone finally had the brilliant idea to actually test the chemical composition of these fossils. Revolutionary concept, right? Turns out, when you apply actual science to scientific mysteries, you sometimes get scientific answers. The chemical signature came back as pure fungus. Not plant, not animal, not some weird alien organism, just fungus that had decided to get really, really big. So, Prototaxites was essentially a mushroom that thought it was a redwood tree, except it existed hundreds of millions of years before redwoods were even a possibility. These things were the original pioneers, the first big players on the evolutionary block, and they weren't just tall. They were thick, too, over 3 feet across in some cases. Imagine hiking through that barren, empty landscape I just described and suddenly coming across what looks like a telephone pole made entirely of mushroom material, just standing there, doing absolutely nothing, being weird. It would have been like something out of a horror movie. This massive fungal pillar rising up from empty ground, no leaves, no branches, no obvious signs of life. Just this bizarre organic tower that somehow managed to stay upright without falling over. The internal structure was pure fungus architecture, too. When scientists examined thin slices under microscopes, they found the classic fungal tubes all woven together in complex patterns. No wood, no bark, no growth rings like you'd see in trees. Just fungal engineering that had somehow figured out how to build skyscrapers millions of years before anything else even knew what height was. These things had completely conquered the planet. Fossils have been discovered on every continent. Wherever conditions were suitable, up popped another giant mushroom tower. And they lived for incredibly long periods, too. Individual specimens could grow for years, just slowly adding layer after layer of fungal material until they reached their full ridiculous height. Some probably stood in the same spot for decades, just watching tiny arthropods crawl around at their base while doing whatever it is that mushrooms do when they're thinking, which honestly raises some disturbing questions about fungus consciousness that I'm not ready to deal with right now. The underground portion of these organisms was even more impressive than the visible towers. What you could see above ground was literally just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath the soil, they had these absolutely massive fungal networks spreading out in every direction like some kind of organic internet system. These underground networks could stretch for miles in every direction. We're talking about a single Prototaxites potentially having fungal threads reaching out across an area the size of a small city, while those pathetic little ankle-high plants were desperately scrounging for nutrients in their immediate vicinity. These fungal giants were basically operating their own private resource empire. And here's where it gets absolutely unfair for every other living thing on the planet. These underground networks weren't just finding food, they were hoarding it like some kind of prehistoric doomsday prepper. They could store nutrients for tough times, creating massive underground pantries that would make modern survivalists weep with envy. When conditions got harsh and other organisms started dying off, Prototaxites would just casually dip into their reserves and keep growing like nothing had happened. They were playing chess while everyone else was still figuring out checkers. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. While every other living thing was desperately competing for sunlight, fighting tooth and nail for the perfect spot with good lighting, Prototaxites just said, forget all that noise, and went with a completely different approach. They didn't need sunlight at all. Zero dependence on that big yellow ball in the sky. Instead, they just ate garbage, dead plant matter, decomposing algae, whatever organic waste was lying around rotting in the perpetual humidity. This gave them such an insane advantage that it's almost embarrassing for everything else. Every plant on Earth had to worry about getting shaded out, had to stress about finding the perfect real estate with optimal sun exposure. But Prototaxites could set up shop literally anywhere there was dirt and dead stuff, which in a world where everything kept dying because life was still basically in beta testing mode, was pretty much everywhere. They had turned the entire planet into their personal buffet. The competition situation was even more ridiculous. What competition? The tallest plants around were maybe hitting 2 feet on their absolute best day. That's not competition. That's barely even background noise. Prototaxites had the entire vertical space to themselves. No one was fighting them for the top spot, because no one else could even reach the bottom of the top spot. They also figured out the ultimate expansion strategy way before anyone else. These towers grew tall, specifically to launch their spores higher into the air. Basic physics tells you that the taller you are, the farther your spores can travel on wind currents. And those spores were absolutely everywhere. The air back then was probably thick with Prototaxites spores just floating around, looking for new patches of ground to colonize. Any decent spot with some organic matter could potentially become home to a brand new fungal skyscraper. They had colonized the planet more thoroughly than humans have managed to do, and they pulled it off 400 million years before humans even existed. The climate was working in their favor, too. All that heat and humidity I mentioned earlier was basically perfect fungus weather. While other organisms were struggling with the extreme greenhouse conditions, Prototaxites was absolutely thriving. Hot and humid is exactly what fungi love most. They were living their best life while everything else was just trying not to die from heat exhaustion. And here's the kicker. Nothing was eating them. There were no herbivores back then. No animals large enough or interested enough to take a bite out of a 30-foot mushroom tower. The biggest threat they faced was maybe some tiny bug boring a small hole in their trunk, which was about as dangerous to them as a mosquito bite is to a human. They could literally just grow around any damage and keep going like nothing had happened. They had no natural predators, unlimited food sources, perfect growing conditions, and zero competition for their ecological needs. They had basically won the evolutionary lottery and then kept winning it over and over again for 50 million years straight. The soil itself started working for them too. As generations of Prototaxites lived and died and regrew, they were actively improving the ground conditions around their towers. The areas where fungal giants had established themselves became richer and more fertile, which attracted more dead plant matter, which fed the fungus even better, which made the soil even richer. They had created their own positive feedback loop that just kept making their dominance more and more unshakable. By the time other organisms started figuring out how to grow taller, Prototaxites had already claimed every prime piece of real estate on the planet. They had first mover advantage on a global scale. Every good spot was already occupied by a giant mushroom that had been standing there longer than entire species had existed. For 50 million years, this strategy was completely unbeatable. Nothing could even come close to challenging them, and their unchallenged dominance turned them into something way more important than just tall mushrooms. These fungal towers became the architects of entire ecosystems. You might think they just stood there doing nothing except growing, but that would be completely wrong. These things were basically ancient apartment complexes, except instead of noisy neighbors and broken air conditioning, they had insects living inside them. Lots and lots of insects. Scientists found fossil evidence of tiny tunnels riddled throughout Prototaxites trunks. Little bore holes where early insects had moved in and made themselves comfortable. And we're not talking about just a few random holes here and there. Some fossils look like Swiss cheese, if Swiss cheese was made of mushroom and happened to be 30 feet tall. These weren't random holes either. They were organized and planned out. The bugs that created them knew exactly what they were doing. They carved out little hallways and chambers inside the fungus, creating their own miniature neighborhoods. And the fungus just grew around the tunnels and kept expanding, like it didn't even care. Think about being a millipede back then. Your housing options were basically under a rock or inside a giant mushroom. That's not exactly a difficult choice to make. The mushroom had climate control, protection from predators, and room service in the form of edible walls. You could literally eat your house, and it would grow back. These insects had figured out luxury living 400 million years before humans invented the concept of hotels. The fungus didn't seem to mind the company either. Some scientists think the bugs might have actually been helping by doing maintenance work, cleaning out dead tissue and keeping air flowing through the structure. Outside the towers, things got interesting too. A 30-foot-tall mushroom casts a pretty serious shadow. In a world where everything else was getting fried by constant, intense sunlight, that shade was prime real estate. Tiny plants and mosses could actually survive in the shadow of these giants. They created little pockets of slightly less horrible living conditions scattered across the landscape. The humidity was different around them, too. All that fungal activity was pumping moisture into the air, creating their own mini weather systems. If you were a small creature trying not to dry out in that prehistoric greenhouse climate, hanging around Prototaxites was probably your best survival strategy. And when these towers finally died and toppled over, that's when the real party got started. A dead Prototaxites was basically a 30-foot-long all-you-can-eat buffet for every decomposer in the area. Bacteria, smaller fungi, insects, whatever passed for scavengers back then all showed up for the feast. These fallen giants would take years to completely break down, and during that whole time, they were absolutely bustling with activity. Different creatures specialized in different stages of the decay process. Some went for the fresh fungal tissue. Others waited for it to get properly rotten. And the really patient ones stuck around for the final stages when everything was nice and gross. This whole death and decay cycle was also building better soil. Every time one of these giants lived and died, it was pumping organic matter into the ground, making it richer and more fertile for the next generation. The fungal networks underground were busy trading nutrients with smaller fungi, and probably some of those tiny plants, too. It was like the world's first farmer's market, except everything was microscopic, and nobody had invented money yet. Some researchers even think Prototaxites might have formed partnerships with algae or early plants growing on their surfaces, though that's not confirmed yet. But here's the strangest part about all of this. This entire ecosystem was temporary. Every Prototaxites eventually died, taking its whole little community down with it. But then new spores would spread, and new towers would pop up somewhere else, and the cycle would start all over again. For millions of years, wherever you found Prototaxites, you found life. Real, thriving, complex life in an otherwise pretty empty and boring world. They weren't just surviving in this hostile environment. They were creating the conditions that allowed other things to survive too. But their incredible 50-million-year winning streak was about to come to a very permanent end, because everything changed the moment plants figured out how to stop being pathetic and actually grow tall. And when that happened, the age of giant mushroom dominance was over forever. The first real threat to show up was something called Archaeopteris, and this thing was not messing around. It shot up over 30 feet tall, had actual wood, real roots, and honest-to-goodness leaves. Not those sad little stub things that had been pretending to be plants before. We're talking about full, proper leaves. Lots of them. Archaeopteris was everything Prototaxites wasn't. Fast-growing, sunlight-obsessed, and absolutely ruthless when it came to claiming territory. Where a fungal tower might take decades to reach its full height, these new trees could rocket upward in just a few years. They were the overachievers that made everyone else look like they weren't even trying. But speed wasn't their only advantage. These trees brought backup, serious backup. Once one type of plant figured out the secret to growing tall, suddenly every plant on the planet wanted in on the action. Ferns started stretching upward. Seed plants appeared out of nowhere. Before you knew it, there were actual forests sprouting up everywhere you looked. And these weren't just random collections of tall plants standing around trying to look impressive. These were full ecosystems, complex, interconnected, resource-hogging ecosystems that completely changed the rules of the game. The underground warfare was absolutely brutal. Tree roots were aggressive in ways that fungal networks had never experienced. They didn't politely share nutrients with the local fungal threads like some kind of prehistoric cooperative. They actively competed. They formed alliances with smaller fungi that helped them grab even more resources from the soil. They basically turned the entire underground into their personal territory. Remember those extensive fungal networks that had made Prototaxites so completely dominant? Well, suddenly they had real competition for the first time in 50 million years. Tree roots could dig deeper, spread wider, and work faster than fungal threads ever could. The trees were winning the resource war, and they were winning it decisively. Above ground wasn't any better for the fungal giants. Those massive tree canopies started blocking out enormous amounts of sunlight. Now, Prototaxites didn't need sunlight for energy, but a lot of the small plants and algae that it fed on absolutely did need that light to survive. When forests moved into an area, the food sources just started vanishing. All that decomposing organic matter that had sustained giant fungi for millions of years suddenly became scarce. The trees were hogging all the nutrients, and there wasn't enough rotting material left over to keep the fungal towers fed. The climate started shifting too, and not in favor of the mushroom giants. All those trees were actively pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and pumping out oxygen instead. The hot, humid greenhouse conditions that fungi absolutely loved were cooling down and becoming more seasonal. The world was transforming into something cooler and less fungus-friendly. Then came the fires. Forests burn. That's just what they do. Lightning strikes, things dry out, and suddenly you've got wildfires racing across entire landscapes. Prototaxites, with their slow growth and years of investment in each individual tower, simply couldn't handle that kind of disturbance. A fire that a tree could bounce back from in a few years would completely wipe out decades' worth of fungal growth. The new forest ecosystems were bringing new types of animals too. More insects, early amphibians, and eventually creatures that actually ate living plants instead of just waiting for them to die first. The whole concept of herbivores was brand new, and it was terrible news for anything that couldn't defend itself or regrow quickly after being damaged. Prototaxites had evolved in a world where absolutely nothing tried to eat them while they were alive. Now there were creatures starting to experiment with the radical idea that organic matter didn't have to be dead to be food. Some of these early plant eaters probably took experimental bites out of fungal towers just to see what would happen. And unlike those tiny, harmless insects that Prototaxites could easily grow around, these bigger herbivores could cause serious structural damage that was much harder to repair. The writing was definitely on the wall, or more accurately, the writing was showing up in the fossil record. Starting around 370 million years ago, Prototaxites fossils started becoming rarer and rarer. The giants that had dominated every single landscape on Earth for 50 million years were losing ground everywhere they had once ruled supreme. Competition for prime real estate became absolutely fierce. Those swampy, nutrient-rich areas where fungal towers had always thrived were now exactly the same places that trees wanted to establish themselves. And trees turned out to be much better at claiming territory and actually keeping it once they had it. They could grow faster, spread their influence wider, and once they got established in an area, they were incredibly difficult to dislodge. The final nail in the coffin was probably the forests themselves becoming completely self-sustaining. Once you had enough trees growing in one location, they started creating their own weather patterns, their own soil conditions, their own everything. They didn't need the outside world anymore because they had literally become the outside world. By the end of the Devonian period, around 360 million years ago, Prototaxites fossils completely vanished from the geological record. After 50 million years of totally unchallenged dominance, the giant fungi were gone. Not just reduced in size, not just pushed to marginal habitats, but completely extinct. The age of forests had officially begun, and there simply wasn't any room left for 30-foot-tall mushrooms anywhere on the planet. The trees had won the height war, the resource war, and ultimately the entire evolutionary war. Game over for the fungal giants. But here's the thing about their spectacular defeat. It turned out to be the best possible thing that could have happened for the future of complex life on Earth, including us. If those giant mushrooms had somehow managed to win their war against the trees, our planet would still be covered in fungal towers today. No forests would mean no diverse ecosystems. No diverse ecosystems would mean no complex animal evolution. No complex animal evolution would mean you wouldn't be watching this video right now, because humans would never have happened in the first place. We exist purely because a mushroom empire failed spectacularly. The soil underneath your feet right now? Prototaxites helped build that over 50 million years of pumping organic matter into the ground. All that rich, fertile earth created the foundation the trees needed to grow and thrive. They basically spent millions of years accidentally preparing the planet for their own replacement. It's probably the most unintentionally brilliant thing in the entire history of evolution. Those forests that eventually wiped out the fungal giants became the ecosystems that supported the first amphibians crawling out of the water onto land. Those amphibians evolved into reptiles. Reptiles became dinosaurs and eventually mammals. Mammals eventually became us. The entire chain of events that led to complex life on Earth started the moment trees figured out how to kill giant mushrooms. But fungi didn't just disappear completely. They got way smarter about their survival strategy. Today, the largest living organism on the entire planet is still a fungus. The honey fungus in Oregon covers over 2,000 acres underground. It's absolutely massive. It's just completely invisible from the surface. Modern fungi learned the lesson that Prototaxites never figured out. Stay hidden, stay small above ground, and dominate everything from below where nobody can see you. Every forest you've ever walked through is secretly controlled by vast fungal networks connecting tree roots, trading nutrients, and basically operating the invisible internet of the woods. Prototaxites was doing all of this 400 million years ago. They just made the fatal mistake of being obvious about it. And here's the really mind-bending part. We came incredibly close to living in a completely different timeline. If plants had evolved differently, if the climate hadn't changed in exactly the right way, if any number of tiny factors had gone in another direction, giant fungi might still rule the world today. You could be looking up at 30-foot mushroom towers instead of oak trees right now, but they lost their evolutionary gamble, and their spectacular failure gave us absolutely everything we know. The forests that produce the oxygen we breathe, the diverse landscapes that make Earth interesting instead of just weird, the entire foundation for complex life. All of it traces back to that crucial moment when plants finally grew tall enough to cast shadows on the world's first skyscrapers. Prototaxites had ruled Earth longer than humans have even existed as a species. 50 million years of completely unchallenged dominance. And all it took was some plants figuring out wood to bring down their entire empire forever. Evolution doesn't care about your track record or how long you've been successful. It only cares about who can adapt to change the fastest. The age of mushroom towers was finally over. The age of everything else we recognize as normal was just beginning. And that transformation happened because of one of the most important failures in the history of life on Earth. But what makes this evolutionary plot twist even more fascinating is how these fungal giants actually lived their daily lives, if you can call it that. Because when you really dig into the details of how Prototaxites operated, it becomes clear that they weren't just tall mushrooms standing around looking impressive. They were running sophisticated biological operations that would make modern corporations jealous. Think about the logistics for a second. How do you maintain a 30-foot tall structure made entirely of living fungal tissue without it just collapsing under its own weight? These things didn't have the luxury of wood like trees do. Wood is basically nature's version of steel reinforcement. It's strong, it's rigid, it can handle serious structural stress without breaking. Fungal tissue, on the other hand, is typically soft and squishy. It's not exactly known for its load-bearing capabilities, yet somehow Prototaxites managed to engineer these massive towers that could stand upright for decades without falling over. The internal architecture they developed was absolutely ingenious. Instead of trying to make their tissue harder like wood, they went with a completely different approach. They created these incredibly complex networks of interwoven fungal tubes that distributed weight and stress throughout the entire structure. It was like biological scaffolding, except the scaffolding was also the building itself. Each tube was relatively small and flexible on its own, but when you wove thousands of them together in the right patterns, they created something that was surprisingly strong and stable. It's the same principle that makes rope stronger than the individual fibers that compose it, except these fungal ropes were arranged in three-dimensional matrices that could support enormous vertical loads. And here's where it gets really clever. Unlike trees, which basically build themselves once and then just maintain what they've got, Prototaxites was constantly rebuilding itself from the inside out. The fungal tubes weren't permanent structures. They were living, growing, changing networks that could adapt to stress and damage in real time. If part of the tower got damaged by weather or insects or whatever, the fungal network could literally reroute around the problem. It would grow new tubes to bypass damaged areas, reinforce weak spots, and basically perform ongoing maintenance on itself automatically. It was like having a building that could repair its own foundation while you were still living in it. The energy requirements for maintaining these towers must have been absolutely staggering too. We're talking about keeping 30 feet of living tissue fed, hydrated, and metabolically active 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years at a time. And remember, these things didn't photosynthesize. They couldn't just soak up sunlight and call it a day like plants do. Every single calorie had to come from breaking down dead organic matter, which meant their underground networks had to be incredibly efficient at finding and processing food sources. They were basically running biological mining operations that extended for miles in every direction, constantly searching for new deposits of rotting material to harvest. The scale of these underground operations was probably more impressive than the visible towers themselves. Imagine if you could see through the soil and watch these fungal networks in action. You'd see thousands of microscopic threads spreading out like a vast spiderweb, probing every square inch of ground for anything edible. When they found something good, like a dead plant or a pile of decomposing algae, the entire network would focus on that location. Fungal threads would converge from all directions, breaking down the organic matter and transporting the nutrients back to the main tower through a complex system of biological pipelines. It was like having a city-sized digestive system buried under the ground, constantly feeding a single massive organism. The coordination required to manage something like that is mind-boggling when you really think about it. These networks had to balance resource allocation between thousands of different fungal threads, prioritize which food sources to exploit first, and maintain supply lines across distances that would challenge modern logistics companies. And they were doing all of this without any kind of central nervous system or brain to coordinate the operation. It was pure biological networking, with individual fungal cells communicating through chemical signals to create emergent intelligence at the organism level. The reproduction strategy was equally sophisticated. Remember, these towers grew tall specifically to launch their spores as far as possible. But it wasn't just about height. The timing had to be perfect, too. Spores are incredibly vulnerable when they're first released. They need exactly the right environmental conditions to survive the journey and successfully establish themselves in new locations. So Prototaxites had to monitor weather patterns, atmospheric humidity, wind currents, and seasonal changes to determine the optimal moments for spore release. Too early, and the spores would dry out before finding suitable habitat. Too late, and they might miss the window of favorable conditions entirely. When the moment was right, these towers would release absolutely massive clouds of spores into the atmosphere. We're talking about billions of microscopic reproductive cells being launched simultaneously from towers scattered across entire continents. The sheer scale of this coordinated reproductive effort would have been visible from space if anyone had been around to see it. The spores themselves were engineering marvels, too. They had to be tough enough to survive weeks or months floating through the atmosphere, resistant to radiation and temperature extremes, yet still capable of rapid germination when they finally found suitable ground to colonize. Each spore was essentially a complete survival kit, packed into a microscopic package. It contained all the genetic information needed to grow a new 30-foot tower, plus enough stored energy to survive the initial establishment phase, plus chemical sensors to evaluate potential landing sites, plus protective coatings to shield against environmental hazards, and the success rate was apparently pretty good, considering how thoroughly Prototaxites managed to colonize the planet. These spores were landing everywhere and successfully establishing new towers in locations separated by thousands of miles. They had figured out global distribution long before any other organism even understood what continents were. The social dynamics between different Prototaxites towers is another fascinating aspect that most people never consider. These weren't just individual organisms scattered randomly across the landscape. They were part of interconnected networks that could span enormous distances. Underground fungal threads from different towers would sometimes connect with each other, creating continent-spanning fungal networks that could share resources and information across vast distances. If one tower was dealing with a local food shortage, it could potentially tap into the resource network of towers hundreds of miles away. This kind of cooperative behavior was revolutionary for its time. Most organisms back then were purely competitive, fighting tooth and nail for every scrap of available resources. But Prototaxites had figured out that cooperation could be more beneficial than competition, at least when you're dealing with members of your own species. They were basically running the world's first socialist economy, where resources were shared according to need rather than hoarded by individual towers. It was a level of social organization that wouldn't be seen again in the biological world for hundreds of millions of years. The environmental impact of having these towers scattered across every continent was probably enormous, too. Each tower was essentially a biological weather station, constantly pumping moisture into the atmosphere through respiration and creating local microclimates around its base. Multiply that effect by millions of towers spread across the globe, and you're looking at organisms that were actively influencing planetary weather patterns. They were probably affecting rainfall distribution, humidity levels, and atmospheric composition on a scale that modern humans are only just beginning to understand. The soil chemistry around established towers would have been completely different from areas without them. All that organic matter being processed and concentrated by the underground networks was creating pockets of incredibly rich, fertile ground scattered across otherwise barren landscapes. These fertile zones became magnets for whatever small plants and primitive organisms were struggling to survive in the harsh conditions of early Earth. The towers were essentially creating oases of biological activity in an otherwise hostile world, serving as stepping stones that allowed other forms of life to gradually spread and diversify. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Prototaxites was how they managed to maintain their dominance for so incredibly long. 50 million years is an almost incomprehensible length of time from a human perspective. That's longer than the entire history of human civilization multiplied by several thousand times. During that span, they faced countless challenges, climate changes, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, ice ages, periods of drought, floods, and who knows what other catastrophic events. Yet somehow they persevered through all of it, maintaining their position as the dominant life form on Earth through environmental changes that wiped out countless other species. Their secret was probably their incredible adaptability. Unlike more specialized organisms that were adapted to specific environmental conditions, Prototaxites was generalist enough to handle whatever Earth threw at them. Hot climate, no problem. Fungi love heat. Cold snap, they could slow down their metabolism and wait it out. Drought, their underground networks could tap into water sources that surface organisms couldn't reach. They were essentially the biological equivalent of cockroaches, except instead of being small and hidden, they were massive and impossible to ignore. They had found an ecological strategy that was robust enough to handle almost any conceivable environmental stress, which makes their eventual extinction even more remarkable. After surviving everything that Earth could throw at them for 50 million years, they were finally brought down by something that seemed relatively harmless at first. A few plants figuring out how to grow a little taller shouldn't have been enough to topple an empire that had weathered countless catastrophes. But that's exactly what happened. The rise of forests didn't just compete with Prototaxites for resources. It fundamentally changed the rules of the game in ways that made their entire survival strategy obsolete overnight, at least in geological terms. The speed of their collapse was probably as remarkable as the length of their dominance. Within just a few million years, they went from ruling every continent to complete extinction. It was one of the most dramatic evolutionary reversals in Earth's history, and it happened because they had become so perfectly adapted to one set of environmental conditions that they couldn't adjust when those conditions changed. Their underground networks, which had been their greatest strength, became a liability when trees started competing for the same soil resources. Their height advantage, which had been unassailable for millions of years, became irrelevant when forests created canopies that blocked out the sun for everything growing below. Their reproductive strategy, which had successfully colonized the entire planet, became ineffective when there were no longer suitable habitats for their spores to colonize. Everything that had made them successful suddenly worked against them. It's a perfect example of how evolution doesn't reward past success. It only cares about current fitness. Prototaxites had been incredibly fit for the environmental conditions of early Earth, but when those conditions changed, their fitness plummeted to zero almost instantly. The irony is that they had actually helped create the conditions that would eventually destroy them. All that soil improvement from millions of years of processing organic matter had created the rich, fertile ground that trees needed to thrive. They had literally been preparing the earth for their own replacement without realizing it. Their legacy lives on, though, even if most people don't realize it. Every forest, every garden, every patch of fertile soil on Earth contains traces of the work that Prototaxites did during their 50 million year reign. The complex soil ecosystems that support modern plant life are built on foundations that these fungal giants helped establish. And modern fungi, while much smaller and less obvious, are still using many of the same strategies that made Prototaxites successful. The underground networks, the cooperative resource sharing, the ability to process dead organic matter more efficiently than any other type of organism. These are all traits that originated with those ancient fungal towers. In many ways, Prototaxites didn't really go extinct. They just got smaller and smarter about staying hidden. The largest organism on Earth today is still a fungus. It's just spread out underground, where most people never notice it. But imagine if they had somehow managed to adapt to the changing conditions. Imagine if they had figured out how to compete with trees instead of being displaced by them. We might still be living in a world dominated by 30-foot mushroom towers, with forests relegated to small patches of marginal habitat. Human civilization would have developed completely differently. Our entire relationship with the natural world would be based on fungal ecosystems instead of forest ecosystems. Our architecture our agriculture, our understanding of biology, everything would be fundamentally different. Instead of building with wood, we might have learned to grow buildings out of living fungal networks. Instead of farming plants, we might have developed fungiculture as our primary food production method. Instead of paper made from trees, we might be writing on sheets of processed fungal tissue. It's fascinating to consider how many of the basic assumptions we make about life on Earth are actually just accidents of evolutionary history. The dominance of plants over fungi, the existence of forests, the development of complex animal life, all of it happened because of a few key evolutionary innovations that emerged at exactly the right moment to tip the balance of power. If the timing had been slightly different, if plants had taken a few million years longer to figure out how to grow tall, or if some environmental catastrophe had wiped out the early tree species, the entire trajectory of life on Earth could have been completely different. We're living in the aftermath of one of the most important biological revolutions in Earth's history, and most people have no idea it ever happened. The transition from fungal dominance to plant dominance was as significant as the extinction of the dinosaurs. But because it happened so long ago and involved organisms that most people don't think about, it gets overlooked in popular discussions of evolutionary history. Yet, without this transition, nothing else we recognize as normal would exist. No flowers, no fruit trees, no grassy meadows, no complex animal ecosystems, no humans. The entire biological world we inhabit is a direct result of plants winning their war against giant mushrooms 400 million years ago. It's one of those moments where you realize that the history of life on Earth is far stranger and more contingent than most people imagine. We think of the current state of the world as inevitable, as the natural result of evolutionary progress. But really, it's just one possible outcome among countless alternatives that never happened. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you have to wonder what other major evolutionary transitions we might be living through right now without realizing it. What current dominant life forms might be facing their own version of the Prototaxites extinction. What seemingly minor innovations happening today might completely reshape the biological world millions of years from now. The story of the giant mushroom towers is ultimately a reminder that nothing in evolution is permanent. Dominance can last for millions of years and then disappear almost overnight when conditions change. The only constant is change itself, and the organisms that survive are the ones that can adapt fastest to whatever comes next. Which brings us to one of the most mind-blowing aspects of this whole evolutionary saga that most people never consider. These fungal empires weren't just passively existing on the landscape. They were actively terraforming the planet in ways that would make modern geoengineering projects look like backyard gardening. Now think about what happens when you have millions of 30-foot-tall biological processors scattered across every continent, all of them constantly breaking down organic matter and cycling nutrients through the soil. We're talking about a planetary-scale composting operation that had been running non-stop for 50 million years. The sheer volume of material these things were processing is almost impossible to comprehend. Each tower was essentially a biological factory that could take dead plant matter, decomposing algae, and whatever other organic waste was lying around, and transform it into rich, fertile soil at an industrial scale. Multiply that by millions of towers operating simultaneously across the globe, and you're looking at the most massive soil creation project in Earth's history. They were literally building the foundation that would eventually support every ecosystem we know today. But here's where it gets really wild. They weren't just processing existing organic matter, they were also creating entirely new types of chemical compounds that had never existed before in Earth's history. When fungal networks break down complex organic molecules, they don't just release simple nutrients back into the soil. They also produce all kinds of secondary metabolites, complex organic compounds that can have profound effects on other organisms. Some of these compounds are toxic and help protect the fungus from competitors. Others are beneficial and actually encourage the growth of symbiotic organisms. Over 50 million years, Prototaxites was essentially conducting the world's largest chemistry experiment, pumping countless new molecular compounds into soil and groundwater systems across every continent. Some of these compounds probably played crucial roles in the evolution of early plant and animal life. It's entirely possible that some of the biochemical pathways we see in modern organisms first evolved as responses to chemical environments created by these ancient fungal networks. They weren't just shaping the physical landscape, they were influencing the molecular evolution of life itself. The scale of their environmental impact becomes even more staggering when you consider their effect on atmospheric composition. Each tower was essentially a massive biological chimney, constantly releasing gases and water vapor into the atmosphere through respiration and metabolic processes. With millions of these chimneys operating simultaneously, they were probably influencing global weather patterns in ways that we're only beginning to understand. They were pumping enormous amounts of water vapor into the atmosphere, which would have affected precipitation patterns across entire continents. They were also releasing various organic compounds into the air that could have served as nucleation sites for cloud formation. In other words, these fungal towers might have been actively controlling where and when it rained across large portions of the planet. The atmospheric chemistry during the age of Prototaxites would have been completely different from anything we see today. The air would have been thick with fungal spores, organic volatiles, and water vapor being pumped out by millions of biological towers. It would have smelled different, felt different, and probably would have had measurable effects on human health if we had been around to experience it. And then there's the question of what happened to all that biomass when the towers finally started dying out. We're talking about millions of 30-foot-tall structures made entirely of organic material, all decomposing simultaneously as the species went extinct. The amount of carbon and nutrients that would have been released back into the environment during this mass die-off would have been absolutely enormous. It was probably one of the largest organic matter release events in Earth's history, and it happened right at the moment when the first forests were trying to establish themselves. This massive influx of nutrients from decomposing fungal towers might have actually accelerated the growth of early tree populations. The very organisms that were driving Prototaxites to extinction were potentially benefiting from the nutrients released by their decomposing competitors. It's like the ultimate evolutionary irony. These fungal giants had spent 50 million years building up massive stores of organic matter in their tissues and underground networks. And when they finally died, they basically provided the fertilizer that allowed forests to explode across the planet. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for the trees. Just as they were figuring out how to grow tall and compete for vertical space, suddenly there was this enormous pulse of available nutrients from the dying fungal empire. It was like getting a massive head start in an evolutionary arms race. But the story gets even more complex when you start thinking about the microorganisms that were living inside these fungal towers. Remember all those insect tunnels that paleontologists found in the fossils? Well, insects weren't the only things making homes inside Prototaxites. These towers were probably teeming with bacteria, smaller fungi, protists, and all kinds of microscopic life that we'll never find evidence of because they don't fossilize well. Each tower was essentially a 30-foot-tall ecosystem unto itself, supporting countless species of microorganisms that had evolved specifically to live inside fungal tissue. When Prototaxites went extinct, all of these microscopic ecosystems disappeared with them. We're talking about the simultaneous extinction of potentially thousands of species that had spent millions of years adapting to life inside fungal towers. It was probably one of the largest biodiversity loss events in Earth's history, and we have almost no record of it because the organisms were too small to leave fossils. Some of these lost species might have had incredible biotechnological potential if they had survived to the present day. Organisms that evolved to live inside fungal networks would have developed unique biochemical capabilities for breaking down complex organic molecules, producing novel compounds, and surviving in challenging environmental conditions. We might have lost the biological equivalent of wonder drugs, revolutionary industrial processes, or breakthrough biotechnologies when those microbial ecosystems vanished along with their fungal hosts. It's impossible to know what we might have learned from studying organisms that had 50 million years to perfect their symbiotic relationships with giant fungi. The psychological impact of living in a world dominated by 30-foot mushroom towers would have been profound, too, if any organism with sufficient cognitive capacity had existed back then. Imagine being a small creature navigating through landscapes where these massive, alien-looking structures were the dominant visual feature. These weren't trees with familiar shapes and growth patterns. They were bizarre organic pillars that would have looked more like something from science fiction than anything you'd expect to see in the natural world. The sight of hundreds of these towers stretching to the horizon would have been genuinely otherworldly. The silence around them would have been equally unsettling. Trees rustle in the wind, birds nest in their branches, leaves create all kinds of ambient sounds that make forests feel alive. But fungal towers would have been largely silent. No leaves to rustle, no branches for animals to inhabit, just these massive, quiet pillars standing motionless in the landscape. The only sounds would have been the occasional creaking of the fungal tissue as it expanded and contracted with temperature changes, maybe some scuttling from insects moving around inside the tunnels, and the soft sounds of spores being released during reproductive events. It would have created an atmosphere that was simultaneously alive and dead, organic yet alien, familiar yet completely foreign to anything in our experience. Walking through a landscape dominated by these towers would have felt like exploring the surface of another planet. And the smell. Fungi have very distinctive odors, usually earthy and sometimes slightly unpleasant, depending on what they're decomposing. Now, imagine that smell magnified by millions of 30-foot-tall organisms all processing organic matter simultaneously. The air would have had a constant fungal undertone that would have been unlike anything in the modern world. During spore release events, the atmosphere would have become thick with microscopic reproductive cells. The air would have been hazy, almost dusty, with billions of spores floating around, looking for new places to establish colonies. Breathing would have been like constantly inhaling a fine organic powder. For any organism with respiratory systems, this would have presented serious challenges. Modern humans would probably have had difficulty breathing in such an environment without some kind of filtration system. The constant exposure to fungal spores could have triggered allergic reactions or respiratory problems in species that hadn't evolved specifically to handle such conditions. But for the organisms that did thrive in this environment, it would have been paradise. The constant rain of organic matter from decomposing fungal tissue, the rich nutrient cycling happening underground, the stable microclimates created by the towers themselves. It was probably one of the most biologically productive periods in Earth's history, at least in terms of fungal ecosystems. The diversity of specialized organisms that evolved to take advantage of this unique environment was probably incredible. We only have fossil evidence of the larger, more robust species that were lucky enough to leave preserved remains. But the actual biological diversity during the age of Prototaxites was probably far richer than anything we can reconstruct from the fossil record. There were probably specialist species that evolved to live exclusively on the exterior surfaces of the towers, others that specialized in different zones within the fungal tissue, and still others that had evolved to exploit the specific chemical environments created by different stages of the fungal life cycle. The evolutionary pressure to specialize would have been enormous because of the sheer abundance of available niches. Any organism that could figure out how to exploit some previously untapped aspect of the fungal ecosystem would have had access to virtually unlimited resources. This kind of ecological specialization creates incredibly complex food webs, where species become completely dependent on very specific environmental conditions. When those conditions change, even slightly, the entire system can collapse catastrophically. which is exactly what happened when trees started altering the fundamental rules of the ecosystem. It wasn't just that Prototaxites couldn't compete with trees for resources. It's that the entire web of species that had evolved around fungal dominance suddenly found their highly specialized niches disappearing. The collapse was probably swift and brutal once it started. Specialized species that had spent millions of years adapting to life in fungal ecosystems suddenly found themselves in a world where those ecosystems were vanishing rapidly. They had no fallback strategies because they had never needed them before. It would have been like watching a complex civilization collapse and fast forward all the intricate relationships, the specialized roles, the finely tuned interactions that had developed over millions of years, all of it disappearing within a few thousand generations as the forests took over. The survivors were probably the generalist species that hadn't become too dependent on any specific aspect of the fungal ecosystem, but even they would have faced enormous challenges adapting to a world dominated by completely different types of organisms with completely different ecological strategies. And through all of this evolutionary chaos, the trees just kept growing. They weren't trying to destroy the fungal ecosystems. They were just following their own biological imperatives, growing taller, spreading wider, claiming more territory. But their success spelled doom for an entire biological world that had existed for 50 million years. It's a perfect example of how evolutionary change often happens, not through direct conflict, but through one group of organisms simply being better adapted to changing environmental conditions. The trees didn't defeat Prototaxites in battle. They just made the world unsuitable for giant fungal towers to exist. Looking back at this transition now, it's clear that we're living in the aftermath of one of the most dramatic ecosystem shifts in Earth's history. Everything we think of as normal in the natural world, from forests to grasslands to complex animal communities, all of it exists because plants managed to overthrow the fungal empire that had ruled Earth for 50 million years. But here's the really fascinating part about all of this. The genetic instructions for building 30-foot-tall fungal towers still exist somewhere in the fungal genome. Evolution doesn't usually delete successful strategies completely. It just suppresses them when they're no longer advantageous. Modern fungi still have most of the same basic capabilities that Prototaxites had. They can form extensive underground networks. They can process organic matter efficiently. They can grow rapidly under the right conditions. They just don't do it on the same massive scale because the environmental conditions that made such gigantism advantageous no longer exist. If something happened to eliminate or drastically reduce modern forest ecosystems, it's theoretically possible that fungi could evolve back toward their ancient strategy of growing massive above-ground structures. The genetic toolkit is probably still there, just waiting for the right environmental pressures to activate it again. It's a sobering thought that the biological world we think of as permanent and stable is actually just one possible configuration among countless alternatives. The dominance of plants over fungi isn't some inevitable result of evolutionary progress. It's just the current state of an ongoing competition that has been going on for hundreds of millions of years. And that competition isn't over. It's still happening right now all around us in ways that most people never notice. Every forest, every garden, every patch of soil is a battleground where plants and fungi are constantly competing for resources and territory. Most of the time, they've reached a kind of uneasy truce where both groups benefit from cooperation rather than pure competition. But the underlying evolutionary pressures that led to the rise and fall of Prototaxites are still operating today. Climate change, habitat destruction, pollution, invasive species, all of these modern environmental pressures could potentially shift the balance between different groups of organisms in ways that we can't predict. What seems stable today might be completely transformed within a few decades or centuries. The story of the giant mushroom towers is ultimately a reminder that the natural world is far more dynamic and unpredictable than most people realize. Dominance in evolutionary terms is always temporary. Today's winners can become tomorrow's extinct species if they can't adapt to changing conditions. And somewhere out there, in some laboratory or research facility, scientists are probably trying to figure out how to engineer modern fungi to grow larger structures for biotechnology applications. We might be on the verge of accidentally recreating some version of the Prototaxites strategy, except this time for human purposes rather than natural selection. The genetic tools we're developing for synthetic biology could theoretically be used to build fungal structures that rival the ancient towers in size and complexity. We could potentially create living buildings, self-repairing infrastructure, or biological factories that operate using principles first perfected by organisms that went extinct hundreds of millions of years ago. In a strange way, the age of giant fungal towers might not be completely over. It might just be waiting for the right technology and environmental conditions to return in a completely new form. The difference is that this time, instead of natural selection driving the process, it would be human engineering and design. We could end up living in a world where 30-foot-tall fungal structures are once again part of the landscape. Except instead of competing with forests, they would be working alongside human civilization to create sustainable biological alternatives to traditional construction and manufacturing. The irony would be complete. The same organisms that once ruled Earth before being overthrown by plants could end up becoming humanity's partners in building the technologies we need to survive in a rapidly changing world. Evolution, it turns out, has a sense of humor about these things. So there you have it, the most incredible chapter in Earth's history that most people have never heard of. For 50 million years, our planet was ruled by organisms so bizarre, so completely alien to our modern experience, that they make the wildest science fiction look mundane by comparison. These weren't just big mushrooms. They were the architects of an entire world, the engineers of ecosystems we can barely imagine, the masters of biological technologies that we're only now beginning to understand. They built the soil beneath our feet. They shaped the atmosphere we breathe. And they created the foundation that every forest, every meadow, every garden would eventually grow from. And then they vanished. Completely. After dominating every continent for longer than mammals have existed, they disappeared so thoroughly that we didn't even know they had ever existed until scientists started applying chemistry to century-old fossil mysteries just a few decades ago. Their extinction gave us everything: the forests that produce our oxygen, the diverse ecosystems that support complex life, the entire chain of evolution that eventually led to you sitting here watching this video. We exist because a mushroom empire failed to adapt when the world changed around them. But here's what really gets me about this whole story. Those genetic instructions for building 30-foot tall fungal towers are probably still out there, dormant in modern fungal genomes, just waiting for the right environmental conditions to activate them again. The biological world we think of as permanent and stable is actually just one temporary configuration in an ongoing evolutionary game that's been playing out for hundreds of millions of years. Next time you walk through a forest, take a second to appreciate just how contingent and improbable everything around you really is. Those trees, that soil, the entire ecosystem supporting complex life on Earth, all of it exists because plants managed to overthrow the strangest empire in our planet's history. And who knows? Maybe somewhere in a lab right now, scientists are figuring out how to bring back some version of those ancient fungal technologies. We might be closer than we think to living alongside 30-foot biological structures again, except this time as partners instead of competitors. The age of giant mushroom towers ended 400 million years ago. But evolution has a funny way